seminar. My name is Tim Schulte. I have the privilege of being the president of ZKS. And as you know, we've been, for a couple years now, we have instituted a little gift that we give to the community, which we call our executive briefings, which is a lunchtime seminar where we bring in some of the best minds, typically on a business-related topic. But we did a little project last year on the subject of diversity that was a huge hit. And it was probably the best thing that we did in the way of an executive briefing for the community. And so we wanted to resurrect that. The issue was complicated last year, and it's complicated this year. And we brought together a panelist of true experts on the subject. And I'm not going to introduce them. I'm going to let Katie do that. Katie McKinley is my law partner of 20 years. She is one of the heads of our personal injury litigation group. They specialize in representing companies that are faced with injury, the defense of injury claims. And that can be a pretty broad subject area involving products liability, slip and fall, all types of accidents, frauds, and just other liability claims. They have been super successful, but Katie has always had a heart for the community. She is one of the most caring people we have in our law firm. And so she makes the perfect moderator for this afternoon's event. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie, and I am going to bow out. But thank you all for coming and being a part of what we're doing here at ZKS. Katie?
Thank you, Tim. Welcome to everyone. We are very excited to have you, and I am really excited about the topic today, which is a rising tide lifts all boats. And so part of what we wanted to do is pull some different leaders together from our community who can share with us in terms of the work that is going on to educate, connect, and serve one another in the Central Florida community, and how business leaders can contribute to those efforts. So we are very fortunate to have with us today Mr. William Jefferson. Will has built his education in criminal justice and then obtained a master's degree in public administration. He has served on the FBI Board of Diversity and Inclusion for Central Florida, as well as the Martin Luther King Jr. Initiative with Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings. Will now serves as the Administrative Community Manager with the Peace and Justice Institute at Valencia Community College, and we are very excited to have him with us today. We also have Dr. Bahia Maroon. Dr. Maroon studied anthropology at the University of California and earned a master's and a PhD. She is passionate about combining scientific insights to create solutions and build stronger communities. And Dr. Maroon is president and CEO of the Polis Institute. So we're very happy to have her with us here today. And finally, we have Ali Benitez, who I jokingly refer to as a recovering attorney, who spent many years practicing law and now has shifted gears into the banking world. So Ali has both a JD and an MBA from Stetson and is vice president at JP Morgan Bank. And she obviously puts her time and effort into understanding her clients' needs and helping them plan for the future. Ali is also the founding trustee and board president of the One Pulse Foundation. So we are very grateful to have some different backgrounds and experiences with us today to hopefully share with us what's going on in the community and how we can be more involved in that. And first, I just wanted to give each of our panelists an opportunity to talk with us about what their organization does and how it attempts to connect with the community. So Ali, I'm going to start with you if you would.
Sure, thank you. Just one little edit. I'm not the board president, so I don't want to take away from Earl Crittenden, our board president. The One Pulse Foundation was founded by the owners of Pulse Nightclub, Barbara Poma, pretty shortly after the shooting happened in 2016. So once the city was able to kind of give out the 30 million that was raised, we knew that that space was sacred. So the mission of the One Pulse Foundation is centered around 4 pillars. And the first is constructing the National Memorial and Museum, National Museum, which we hope will open minds, the National Memorial, Memorial that will open hearts, and educational programs that will open eyes, and legacy scholarships that will open doors for individuals. So those are kind of the 4 pillars of the One Pulse Foundation. I think the work that we're doing is not only to honor and remember the 49 souls lost that night, but to hopefully have some kind of change in the thread and fabric of how we treat one another, not only locally, but around the world.
Thank you. Dr. Maroon, could you share with us Polis Institute and kind of its principles and what it's trying to accomplish?
Absolutely. Well, first I want to say thank you so much for having me back this year, and thank you to the firm for putting on this series. So I think that, when we look around, we can all see that there are very troubling disparities in communities and cities that we care about. So when we look across Orlando, for example, we see neighborhoods where prosperity has not become the everyday course of experience for people who live in some of those neighborhoods. And what we do at Polis Institute is we create enduring, lasting relationships and partnerships that build genuine economic mobility and result in authentic racial equity. And the result is that people who have lived in neighborhoods with historically a lack of investment are able to seize opportunities because of new investment, new pathways that they themselves are a part of promoting.
Thank you. And Will, can you share with us the Peace and Justice Institute and the different goals it's trying to accomplish?
So the Peace and Justice Institute at Valencia College primarily sits as a convener in our local community, bringing awareness to missing histories, the importance of connecting to what we call the other, and a way of authentic dialogue. The mission of PJI is to have honest and open dialogue through a set of principles that we use, 13 to be exact, that lead us to empathy building and perspective taking within our local community. The Peace and Justice Institute talks about multiple issues or deals with multiple issues centered around equality, equity, and the needs for an understanding around adverse childhood experiences, as we also know as ACEs. The importance of true diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are our focal points in our local community, and the Peace and Justice Institute makes sure that it aligns itself not only within our community, but on our campuses as well, through connecting the head, the heart, and the hand.
So one thing, in talking about how this is a personal investment that each of you is investing in your organization and trying to invest more in the community. Would you mind sharing with us what types of events, relationships, or experiences in your background led you to the organizations that you serve?
Sure. So I'll start when the shooting happened on June 12th in 2016. I was actually the attorney for Barbara Poma and Pulse. And so I got a call at, I think, 6 a.m. Barbara was out of town. She was in Mexico with her daughter on a school trip. her husband was in Miami with his son, and I got a call from her husband saying someone has been shot at Pulse. And I said, okay, we'll figure this out. Don't worry, we got it handled. And by 7 o'clock, it was 20 people. So I went down to the site, talked to the FBI, and that's when they told me it was 50. So the 49 plus the gunman. And so it's very personal for me. I'm friends with the owners. We're very close. They're like family to me, and also professionally as their attorney. When, for instance, the insurance adjuster had to walk through the club after they took the bodies out, I had to walk through with him. So it affected me deeply, and I think for me, like I said, it's personal, and I think that it's something that we just can't forget. It can't just be another mass shooting. So I hope that the work that we're doing is going to really, like I said, create some kind of change locally and globally.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Maroon, what about you?
For me, doing this work is very much about honoring the gifts and also the responsibilities of living in America. As an anthropologist, I have lived all over the world, I've traveled the world, and the opportunities that we have in this nation to be part of problem solving, to be part of innovative solution creation are absolutely incredible. My mother's family came to the United States in the mid 1700s, and they brought with them technologies of farming and agricultural production. My father's family came to the United States in the 1600s and was part of the group that settled Philadelphia, and subsequently part of the group that established the abolitionist movement in our country. And I grew up walking to school every day in a little collapsing city in New York State, that every day I would walk by this site, which is where the Constitution for the United States was ratified in New York. And to me, our living history is so extraordinary in as much as we are a nation that was founded on debate and dialogue in the pursuit of building a more remarkable nation, not only for the sake of the nation itself, but for the sake of the individuals who live within our country. And so being able to be part of that through my everyday work is a gift and something that I deeply appreciate.
It's interesting because I'm hearing from both you and Mr. Jefferson the importance of dialogue, both for the nation as a whole, and then also, Will, you had mentioned that as part of the goals with the Peace and Justice Institute. Can you share with us any personal experiences or background that led you to your work with the Peace and Justice Institute?
Yeah, so just some historical reference. I personally have had family members in my family go missing at the hands of racial terror in the South. And being exposed to these stories at an early age, the first question that populated was why? So in a search to try to answer that question, it led me to going to a historical Black college, sitting down and really learning what my history was, and then challenging myself to have this conversation in a broader sense. Upon graduating from Bethune-Cookman University, I had the opportunity to interview for a very prestigious company here in Orlando. And while sitting, waiting for that interview, the question came up again after a series of rolling questions from a recruiter at this particular company started asking a secretary multiple questions about me. The first series of questions was, is he here yet? How does he look? Did he sound educated? Do you think he'll fit in here? You know, I'm only having this conversation with them because we have a number to meet. Hearing these series of questions and imagining the deflate that a person would feel in that space, realizing that my educational, my educational goals and strivings weren't what put me in the chair. It was literally to meet the number. I started asking questions why. So it led me to the Peace and Justice Institute, where in the job description for my current role, it said that you can become a pathway of peace. And for me, that was huge because I had the opportunity to change how executives and leaders, how they think about the individuals that frequent their organizations. I got a chance, or I get the opportunity to humanize the conversation about systemic racism and institutional racism. And I get to do it from a very unique position, having experienced it. So that is what brought me to the Peace and Justice Institute, and that is what keeps me with my feet to the ground in this work.
Can you share with us, and I appreciate that personal perspective, both historically in terms of what your family members have encountered and then what you personally observed after working and earning an education and then coming back and having the same expectations or discrimination. Can you talk with us a little bit about what you see through your organization in terms of what is going on in the Central Florida community and the efforts that your organization makes to try to educate and encourage that type of meaningful dialogue?
Yes, definitely. So within Central Florida, within the last year, what we have seen is that a large population of our community is living in what we call toxic stress due to the circumstances that are surrounding this pandemic, health crisis, economic crisis. And for many of the individuals within these communities, there's a lack of clear understanding of how peace or how they could have a form of resilience take place in their life. So what we are doing at the Peace and Justice Institute is we're informing them that instead of having this historical thing of diabetes or high blood pressure or stroke that magically show up in this community, explaining to them through a series of dialogues and workshops that these are things that have been probably experienced from an early childhood experience that the body has kept the score on, and now it is living out in our everyday life. So we are bringing light to the work of resilience, what real true diversity looks like, and moving away from this notion of diversity as the Crayola experience, that when we walk into a room and just because we see a sea of colors, it doesn't mean that we are in fact diverse. It's challenging leaders, it's challenging staff to go the extra mark and look at policies, look at procedures, examine, do some reflection, some interpersonal searchings to see where bias might lie in me. We all have them, but it's our responsibilities to work through them. So through the Peace and Justice Institute, we're having dialogue, and we are sharing stories, lived experiences, creating what we call in our program windows and mirror, allowing an opportunity to see a blind spot from a different perspective, and then turning the mirror on ourselves so that we can do that soul-searching, hard work of examining our behaviors, our structures, and our reach within our local community.
And Dr. Maroon or Ms. Benitez, do you see kind of a similar focus or goal of helping people to recognize the blind spots, helping people to kind of find the maybe implicit biases that they may not even necessarily be aware of and try to challenge that and work through that?
Yeah, I think one thing that happened from from the attack here in 2016 that I saw was community organizations really pulling together, and groups and people who never probably would have worked together coming together. And what we see is in tragedy, that a lot of times lasts 3 months, maybe 6 months. But in Orlando, truthfully, it's 5 years now. And there's things like we had the Orlando United Assistance Center and organizations working together and trying to focus on the needs that we're seeing in the community. COVID has exacerbated that, especially for the LGBTQ community. The HRC did a study last year in the height, in the peak of COVID, and found that LGBTQ people were 8% higher likely to have a reduction of working hours from their jobs, that they were more medically susceptible and less likely to have health coverage. And those things ring true, I think, to some level today. I think for specifically our Central Florida community, as you mentioned earlier, dialogue is important, and keeping the connectivity between organizations is very important, whether they are nonprofit organizations or whether they are corporations or law firms, whatever it is, we have to keep the dialogue, and that's why events like this are so important. But there's a lot of work certainly to be done.
And Dr. Murrin, what are your thoughts on the, kind of part of that goal being the implicit biases and trying to challenge people how to recognize that they exist and then work through them?
Well, the structural injustice costs everyone extraordinarily. It costs our nation trillions of dollars in our GDP. It costs corporations billions of dollars. And it costs communities generational opportunity and equity. To give you an on-the-ground example, a study out of Harvard Business School shows us that 2 executives who come into a firm with the same level of capacity and education, both on the top management track, it will take an African-American executive 11 years in that corporation to achieve parity in terms of their work responsibilities, whereas a white peer will advance by year 2. So you're looking at an 11-year lag. Now you want to translate that 11-year lag into the lived reality of that individual within a community context. So that lack of promotion because of systemic injustice, that translates into per capita income, that translates into taxes that go into schools and so on. And you can see the spiraling snowball. And what we know for sure is that when you simply tell people the right way to do something, that's really not adequate. When you create opportunities for people to come into dialogue and partnership and relationship with each other, and you make change relational and not transactional, then you have the opportunity to do something that's enduring. And I think that when we look at the work of the Peace and Justice Institute, when we look at the work of the Pulse Foundation, the way that we work at Polis Institute, what we all have in common is that we're focused on relationship building. And it's those relationships that make it possible to create enduring change with significant social impact.
And Mr. Jefferson, I saw you kind of nodding at one point with that, and it sounds like the relational piece really speaks to you as well.
Definitely, because before we can even have a conversation, an authentic conversation centered around hard topics like equity, diversity, and inclusion, I first have to have some commonality with you so that when we get into a heated discussion or if the topic becomes hot, you know enough about Will, or I know enough about Dr. Maroon or Allie to not take offense, but allow that to be a moment of education and transformation versus an exaggeration of a problem where we can't come to the table and see eye to eye. So the relationship is the main takeaway. And that is why it has to be at the center of this work. I need to know you, you need to know me. And in doing so, we build rapport with one another. And as I'm building rapport with you and I'm sharing thoughts and experiences with you, you can take that learning into your sphere of influence. And you can say, well, I was in a conversation with a young man, or I was in a conversation with a young woman, and she shared these points of views. Never thought about it, never crossed my mind. I've never experienced it, but there's some validity to what was shared. And that's the importance of why relationship building has to be at the center of anything that we do centered around this word.
Dr. Maroon, can you break it down for us a little bit more in terms of, because you said something that really struck me in terms of the difference between trying to institute change and make it transactional versus trying to include people and make it more relational. Can you kind of break that down a little bit for us in terms of different examples of what that looks like?
Well, we have a remarkable example right here in Orlando, the recent opening of Lake Lorna Doone Park. And Lake Lorna Doone Park was perceived as a community gem for a very long time, but it was in a state of disrepair. In 2013 and 2014, Polis Institute, working alongside Lift Orlando and Florida Citrus Sports, right? So that's the partnerships, that's the relationships. So working alongside those organizations, we conducted a community-wide survey conversation. We knocked on over 3,600 doors, and we had over 1,400 community residents share in conversation what they wanted to see changed in their community. And one of the top things they said was revitalizing Lake Lorna Doone Park. They then came to the table and participated in the charrettes, in the design process, in the fundraising process. And what we have as a result as a city is an over $9.5 million investment in one of the largest ADA accessible parks that also has a series of rippling effects. We know that crime goes down when you've got access to beautiful parks and trees, etc. But the important piece of all of this is that that park came out of conversations. It came out of strong relationship building so that you've got all of these chief executive officers and chief operating officers sitting at tables with long-standing community residents. They know each other on a first name basis now. And that's really what it comes back to is, who do you know on a first name basis that's not part of your everyday network? And if there's one takeaway I offer to all of those who are listening and participating in this conversation today, it's look at your social network and then ask yourself, how can I take 2 steps outside of this comfortable network I've built for myself and create a relationship with someone who's doing meaningful work for change that matters?
Thank you. Ms. Benitez, do you, in terms of the One Pelts, can you kind of share with us how your organization has tried to connect and educate people in the community and kind of bring them together?
Sure. So I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, and I'm a Latina female, so there's a lot of different groups that I feel I belong in. And I think one thing that we're doing at the One Pulse Foundation is trying to make sure that people understand the people who passed away that night, they weren't all in the LGBTQ community. They were mothers, fathers, Black, white, they were all on all spectrum. So we want to tell these stories and reach people throughout the community and get feedback and make sure that something that Will said about the relationships and dialogue, something that I had to learn is we also have to have patience, because sometimes I don't understand why people don't get this, that people can't treat each other with dignity and respect and be on a level playing field. And so I think part of what we're trying to teach through the One Pulse Foundation is that compassion element, that patience element for those who are being marginalized. Our programs are hopefully going to be in curriculums throughout schools. We're also working with law enforcement agencies to hopefully have some training for onboarding the new hires. And we're also doing speaking. So we have our Vice President of Education, Dr. Earl Mowat, who goes and speaks to a number of topics, from LGBTQ rights to racial inequality. And he's published many articles and books on the topic. So we're trying to just reach out and extend not only to the LGBTQ community, but throughout to all different sectors of the community.
And Will, it's my understanding the Peace and Justice Institute also tries to connect with different groups within the community to try to connect and bring them together and have dialogue. Can you share with us some of the different kind of subgroups within the community that the Peace and Justice Institute has opened these dialogues with?
Most definitely. Within our local community, we are in the Muslim community because there's such this deep-bedded stereotype type behavior centered around just Muslims within our culture. We've built partnerships with them. They sit on what we have as an advisory council board where they are able to bring their perspectives and their voices to other individuals within this community. We've also connected with local executive leaders and nonprofits just to bring awareness to the need to have sincere dialogue around topics that range in equity and equality. We've done workshops with women voters. We've done workshops with the African American Chamber. We've gone into community sites and dealt with or built relationships with kids in the Homeless Coalition. So one thing that kind of stands out for PJI is we're only as strong as our connection to the community. And what we have positioned ourselves as within our local community and county is just being that convener. That if there is an issue or if there is a topic that is coming up, we have to have someone that we can rely on in case we lack the knowledge to say, hey, educate us. Hey, come and stand alongside us as we are having these conversations on these particular topics. So that is kind of how PJI has kind of spread itself out. We are a community member, but we are also a part of the community. We're not just here throwing workshops out. We're actually in the community having dialogue with our leaders and just saying to them, how can we help? How can we continue to strengthen Orlando, Central Florida, Orange County as a whole?
In terms of being able to build that type of strong community and be able to engage people and share power more equitably, what foundation or steps do you believe are necessary to help that be accomplished?
Well, the first step that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to present yourself friendly. You're going to have to not just come with a list or a textbook of offerings, but you're going to have to come actually listening. One of our 13 principles that we really use in any interaction that we have with a client is listen deeply. And in that principle, it invites us not just to listen to the words that are surface, but to listen to the meanings and the depth beneath what is being shared to you. And when we do that, when we authentically listen, when we are intentional about listening, we'll discover the real problems that individuals are bringing and highlighting in discussion, and not just take away what we thought we heard. So we listen deeply. When we're in these conversations, we use the principles to suspend our judgment. That just because someone comes and they are, voicing an opinion and they might have a harsh tone behind it, instead of saying, oh, that's the angry person over there, or oh, that community seems to be very rude and disconnected from what's going on over here, we suspend our judgment and we turn to wonder. we wonder how these individuals got to this place. I wonder, in that sternness of that person's voice, I wonder what's happening. Is there a reaction that we can learn from? Is this triggering for that person or this organization or this group? I wonder how many times they've said this to somebody previous or prior to us. And when we start to act in these principles, we can have authentic dialogue and we can build lasting partnerships and relationships.
Ali, I would like to hear from you in terms of that idea of listening deeply and trying to build true understanding as opposed to just kind of listening to respond. Tell me how you see that play out with the different efforts that have been made by One Pulse to connect with the community.
I think what I hope is right now we're going through truly a social movement and not just moment. And I think that it's hard because you can tell organizations or corporations or business leaders to really dig deep, listen authentically, and make an effort, but it has to come from within them. So I think there's also an element where we have to be patient, where we have to keep kind of pushing the envelope and hoping that people challenge themselves to have those hard conversations. And I think we're doing that through our education programs at the One Pulse Foundation. And I hope people, once they feel that uncomfortable feeling, that they continue with the conversation, because that's when things start to happen.
And Dr. Maroon, can you share with us, the question that I asked Will a few minutes ago in terms of what foundation or steps do you believe are necessary to strengthen the community and build a more equitable power sharing structure?
Well, we are extremely ambitious at Polis Institute, and our hope is that every community that is on the side of poverty, communities where we are seeing low rates of high school graduation, low rates of college success, communities where we're seeing low rates of home ownership. Our goal is for communities that fit that dynamic within 10 years of our work in that community, for them to be on parity. And the way that you elevate people's income, the way that you elevate people's capacity to graduate from their educational programs, is to put people first at the forefront of solving their problems, and to understand that in many instances, the assets that we're looking for already exist within communities. It's a question of creating the pathways and the pipelines to opportunity. And so the foundational approach that we take is engagement, data, and action. Engagement means that we reach out to and train community residents in historically disinvested African American and Hispanic communities to become engagement ambassadors, so that they are at the front of getting the word out about opportunities for new educational certifications, for new collective impact organizing, for workshops like Peace and Justice Institute puts on, and so on. So we train and deploy community engagement ambassadors to start shifting people's awareness of what these conversations can be. We then train community research assistants. These community research assistants work right alongside Polis Institute staff, and we collect data across communities so that we have a genuine portrait of what is meaningfully important in that community. What are the assets that already exist within the community, and how can we leverage those assets to create action that's meaningful? And so whereas old philanthropy suggests that people from outside of communities come in, they pour money into a community. We saw this with the Mark Zuckerberg initiative in the school district of New Jersey. Millions of dollars poured into that school district without any substantive impact outcome. That's old philanthropy. Our model is to make it possible for foundations, for municipalities to understand deeply, going back to deep listening, what's possible within the particular context of a disinvested community and what kinds of transformation can be sustained by residents. And the result of that is that we have between $1.70 to a $2.60 return on investment in every community we work in. We recently worked in a community that had not seen investment over $50,000 for 2 decades. 2 decades without capital investment over $50,000. Within 18 months of us working alongside community residents, having conversations with potential investors and foundations, we saw well over $125,000 just in the first 18 months. And all of that is direct investment into community residents. And that's the kind of distinction of success when you put listening to the people who are at the forefront of experiencing the issue, when you put them at the forefront of solving the issue.
Dr. Maroon, you said something a few minutes ago in terms of an action item. If people could hear the stories and the efforts of the groups that we're talking with today and try to expand their horizons and look at how they can expand their networks as one way to start taking steps toward being more engaged. And I would like to invite Will and Allie to share with us any thoughts they have in terms of kind of an action point. If anybody here today is kind of hearing some of what's being said and thinking, I would like to be more engaged or more involved, what are the first steps that they can take to reach out and more fully engage in the community?
So I'd say everything from visiting the interim memorial. I think that's a great step that people can take, whether executive team or whoever it is, and kind of feel, especially if you've never been down there, I think it's a very, very powerful, it's sacred ground. 2, we have, again, Dr. Earl, our VP of Education, who can come in and initiate that dialogue and speak to groups, or Barbara Poma herself, she'll go and speak to groups. Reach out to us. We'll find ways to engage in dialogue and hopefully move forward and make sure that people are, again, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk.
And I would just say, just start to acknowledge that in community, there are going to be biases that show up, and work through those biases, realizing that we all have a set of them. They are in us. But when they show up, we have to look at them and do the work to address them before entering into the community. One thing that I want to say to executive leadership is, don't make it the community's responsibility to train you on these issues. Do your diligence by reading and reaching across the aisle, or reaching across organizations, reaching across sectors to figure out what is happening and what techniques or tools have been implemented by other leaders that you can probably pull from. Secondly, I would say a takeaway is, just like it was mentioned earlier, if we are going to be honest in our approach, we have to look at our systems. We have to go through our phones and through our emails and see who those top 10 are that we rely on. And when we find out those top 10s, make a list, write down their age, write down their sexual orientation, their religion, their political beliefs, where they live, their income brackets, and see if you are in fact living an equitable life. And challenge yourself, if you come into the reality that it isn't, challenge yourself to find ways to connect to the other so that you can build valuable relationships among our community.
Dr. Maroon, you mentioned earlier on talking about the interconnection sometimes between the systemic structural racism that we have and the economic mobility. Can you share with us a little bit in terms of how, what organizations are doing or can do to try to recognize that that interrelationship and get things going on a better path.
Can you precise that a little bit more?
Yeah, there was a discussion in terms of the influence of kind of structural systemic racism with the impact on economics, the impact on economic mobility, and being able. At some point, you were talking about being kind of reaching parity with different groups.
So the first thing I would offer for individuals who are a little uncertain about this phrase structural racism and, you know, what is that about? Is that a real thing? I'm not sure I believe in that. Or individuals who haven't experienced what it is to be on the negative side of racism. And the first thing I would say is, going back to Will's wonderful evocation of Parker Palmer's invitation to all of us to turn to wonder. I wonder why. And so what we suggest to people to do is to look at some of the basic economic data. We have intractable gaps in wealth between African Americans and white Americans. We have enormous gaps in life expectancy, over 10 years difference. We have tremendous gaps, the Hispanic community and the white community in wealth. And the question is, why is that? And we really, you know, folks who, again, are not coming out of communities of color, certainly we don't want to say, like, I'm participating in racism, I've been a racist, and so on. That's really uncomfortable, right? But then when you say, well, I don't believe in structural racism, I don't really believe that racism impacts anything. And so my provocation there is, why then do African Americans only have 20 cents for every $100 of wealth of white Americans in this country? Why are those numbers possible? And then you have to say things that are hard to say out loud. Do you believe that we Black folks are not working as hard? Do you believe that we don't financially plan well? Do you think that we're lazy? You know, the very first thing is, like, you need to just tell the truth about what you believe is true. If you go through those questions and you come through the other side and you say, you know what, I don't believe that African Americans are unwilling to work. I don't believe that African Americans are less likely to want to financially plan. Then you have the opportunity to sit in the answer and say, what does racism, what does prejudice have to do with the disparities I see when I drive down certain blocks in my community? And then you can start to be part of the solution. But if you're genuinely believing, and this is the tie between racism and economic mobility, even when you want to give your money, even when you want to give your help, if you're coming into our communities and you believe that we're suffering from poverty because we have done something wrong and you have the solution, your money is going to go into a black hole and it is not going to solve any issues. But when you come into our communities and you say, I see that this community has no on-ramp for these folks to have transportation access to the best paying jobs in our county. I see this community has no on-ramp for these children to have scholarships to this educational institution, for these children to have shadowing opportunities, mentoring opportunities. When you come into the community and you see this is not because of a lack of will amongst people of color, this is because of a lack of opportunity that is the direct result of centuries of unsolved injustice. Then you can start to do something about economic mobility. then you can start to do something about systemic racism.
That sounds almost like it leads in a bigger sense back to Will's point earlier of the deep listening, of you can't solve a problem if you don't fully understand the problem, or you don't make efforts to open yourself to what the problem really is. Will, did you have thoughts on that in terms of that kind of interrelationship between the economic mobility and the structural systems currently in place, and how you've seen through your work, how you see that play out?
Yeah, I think Dr. Maroon summarized it beautifully. And what I would say, just to add to a component, many times when we look at it from a financial sense, it gives people the opportunity to push away from the table, because the excuse becomes, well, I only deal with budgets, or I only deal with this issue. I'm not dealing with people. But the reality is that money is the biggest driver to economic achievement or depression. And if we are not going to be authentic in our review of where money streams are going within organizations and community, we're causing more harm and continued harm. So this is why we have to have all components at the table having these conversations. The financial analysts, the CFO of your organizations are just as responsible for having these conversations and growing in the knowledge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, just as your frontline staff would be, or even your custodians. It's a larger picture. So if we start to talk about systemic racism or institutional racism, at the heart of those words are you and I, because we make up the institutions. We are making up these systems. Some of us contribute more to the system than others, but it's a system nonetheless that we have to pay attention to.
And part of that, you're talking about true diversity, and I wanted to give Ali and Dr. Maroon a chance to kind of comment on that. Of the, I think, Will, you said earlier, just because you walk in and it's a box of crayons with different colors, that doesn't necessarily mean there's true diversity. I wanted to give Ali and Dr. Maroon a chance to kind of share their thoughts with us on what, how can we reach for true diversity as opposed to just something on the surface?
Yeah, I think, there's a saying that a coworker of mine used to say that I thought was pretty impactful, and diversity is being invited to the dance, and inclusion is being invited to dance. So there's a difference between just making your, I think Will touched on this earlier, having your board appear diverse is different from them actually being diverse. So just making an effort around getting to know people more than just their skin color, their religion, their sexual orientation, and being truly, making an effort to being truly diverse, I think is crucial for organizations and executives and leaders within the community.
Yeah, I think that, at Polis Institute, we encourage the people that we work with, all the stakeholders that we work with, to focus on learning how to share power. And that means learning how to share decision making. You could start practicing this at home with your spouse, decisions that you prefer to make. And you have to make those decisions in consultation. Even more challenging, you can try practicing it with your children who, you don't believe have the capacity and so on. But when you start to, this step after listening and the step after conversation is, am I willing to allow you to share a decision with me? And what I encourage people at the executive level to focus on is, what are the decisions that you don't have to make all by yourself? What are the decisions that you can afford to push yourself to share that process? And part of what I think all of us have been trying to impress on the people who are listening today is that this is a life practice when you're seeking to become part of creating equity and creating inclusion, you have opportunities in your family, in your career, and in your community. And you can choose family, career, community at any time to practice what it looks like to share power, what it looks like to listen deeply, what it looks like to be actively open to solutions you hadn't thought about before. There are all of these opportunities to be part of the change that you want to see.
There was something I wanted to circle back on with you, Will. There was a comment earlier, I think, about being tolerated versus truly belonging. And what Allie and Dr. Maroon just shared kind of made me think of that in terms of the difference between kind of joining on the surface and the difference between truly being engaged and given the authority and power to be a true part of the process. Can you share with us any thoughts you had in terms of that distinction between being tolerated versus being truly included or belonging?
Yeah, and I think what we can all just smile about is as our country has had these conversations and as different sectors are trying to implement change, tolerating somebody versus them feeling like they personally belong or they are a vital part to the success of an organization speaks to culture. And it speaks to creating an atmosphere that's safe for that individual to show up in the full sense of who they are versus just accepting them, but saying to them, yeah, you can work here at this organization. You can say certain things, but you have to look this way. You have to function this way. You have to speak this way. That's the part that causes us to start to tell people, this is the part of you that needs to stay in your car. This is the part of you that when you're getting dressed, you leave at home. And that's damaging to an organization as a whole, because if a person is not allowed to come to a space and occupy it with their full autonomy, their full agency of who they are, you are discounted and discredited as an organization because you then do not get that unique piece of that person. When we talk about acceptance versus tolerance, it's almost like what I stated in my story. Affirmative action was great, but for so many that were hired into positions, that position that they held, they felt like they were just being tolerated versus it being an open door and the right to fully sit in those spaces, knowing that I'm 100% confident in my abilities to compete with any counterpart, any racial group. That's the difference. Creating a space where you recognize that I am the best talent of who I am and allowing me my agency in there is what promotes people to a place of true inclusion versus just acceptance or tolerance. You know, it's kind of like if we were to make this more pragmatic or we were to just bring it home, we have Thanksgiving, even though Thanksgiving last year looked different for many of us. But we always have the uncle that says the wrong things. We tolerate them and we love them to death. But someone has to tap uncle on the shoulder and say to him, you can't say that here because that offended someone else that was attending here. That's how we create an atmosphere that is inclusive. When we see things, we have to speak to them, directly to them, not in subverted ways where we're speaking around a problem, but directly address it. And that's how we can build a culture that is inclusive versus just we just tolerate people.
I think we've reached our time, but I just wanted to share my thanks with this panel. It's been so wonderful to get to know each of you and hear about your background and what your organizations do and the work in the community that's being done. So I appreciate everybody's time and investment and energy in this process. And I just wanted to say thank you. I appreciate you being here.